This slideshow covers part 2 of the presentation on civil rights. Specifically, we will cover civil rights from the 1960s to the present and the legacy of the civil rights movement. In the early 1960s, the NAACP worked to influence judges more than politicians, but influence over the court system did not turn into political victories. They moved to public protests directed against segregation and the authorities who administered segregation policies. The protests sought to influence public opinion, which would then influence Congress and the president. Some examples of protests are Rosa Parks sitting at the front of a bus in 1955 and sit-ins at segregated diners in the 1960s. At this time, segregation in the South separated races in all aspects of social organization: schools, churches, entertainment, hospitals, professions, and even cemeteries were segregated. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader in the civil rights movement. He orchestrated nonviolent demonstrations and other forms of resistance that may have been inspired by Gandhi. However, early efforts faced problems. Finding leaders who could bear the transaction costs and personal risks of protest was difficult. Also, it was tough to get participation from the general public. President Kennedy, possibly worried about the 1964 election and keeping voters in the South, pleaded patience to King and other leaders on segregation. The protests were turning violent, and King and civil rights leaders needed results to show that peaceful protests could be effective. Birmingham had a notoriously intolerant police chief. Protesters in Birmingham were met with police dogs and fire hoses, even though they were peaceful. The arrests were televised, and it created a national crisis that President Kennedy could not ignore. Gallup polls showed for the first time that civil rights were a salient issue for Americans. Kennedy met with civil rights leaders to discuss a strategy for the upcoming election and a commitment to the civil rights movement. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, President Johnson persuaded Senate Republicans to join Northern Democrats in breaking a Southern filibuster. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. The law authorized the national government to end segregation in public education and public accommodations. Though Republicans in Congress were historically in favor of civil rights, their presidential candidate in 1964, Barry Goldwater, was against the civil rights legislation. Johnson and the Democrats ran on a platform centered on civil rights, and this marked a shift in support from black voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Johnson correctly predicted that Democratic support of civil rights would cause them to lose the South in elections for a generation. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. This act appointed voting examiners to make sure that minorities were not kept from voting. It also suspended the use of literacy tests and other mechanisms for suppressing the minority vote. In the 1970s, the civil rights movement moved beyond enforcement in the South to include a broad range of government and private actions that appeared racially discriminatory. Outside of the South, residential discrimination has been seen as a byproduct of former discriminatory housing laws that kept neighbors and schools segregated. The practice of redlining kept minorities from purchasing homes and opening businesses in certain areas. Affirmative action requires those employers and schools that had practiced discrimination to compensate minorities by giving them special consideration in hiring and school admissions. However, in the case of University of California v. Bake, the Supreme Court ruled that university quotas for minorities violated the equal protection rights of white applicants. Suffragists were early feminists fighting for the right to vote. There was a push to include women in the 14th Amendment, but it failed as neither party saw the advantage electorally to having women vote. Public support for women's suffrage increased throughout the 1800s. By 1919, 15 states gave women the right to vote in at least some elections. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson strongly endorsed the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Congress passed it in both houses, and the states ratified it in 1920. Some key legislation in the women's movement includes the Pregnancy Discrimination Act and the Family and Medical Leave Act. These prevented firing and demotion during absences for childbirth and family medical emergencies. The Civil Rights Act of 1991 requires employers to show that unequal hiring and compensation practices do not reflect gender discrimination and gives the right to sue for damages. Women still, of course, face much discrimination in the workplace, and enforcement of some of these policies is weak. Recently, gay rights have been the center of attention in the US. Under the Obama administration, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was ended. This ended the policy of not allowing gays to serve in the military openly. The Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, which prevented the federal government from recognizing gay marriage. States began legalizing gay marriage until the Supreme Court stepped in and ruled that gay marriage bans are unconstitutional. Now, gay marriage is legal in all 50 states. As you can see from the figure, support for gay marriage has risen among all generations, with the highest support being from millennials. Support for gay marriage has risen very quickly in a short period of time dating back to 2001. In the next slideshow, we will be discussing civil liberties, which, as we learned today, are different from civil rights.